Does Malik Nabers have what it takes to be the wide receiver one overall, even with the question marks that we have with the New York Giants offense?
Yeah, so I totally think Nabers can be the wide receiver one overall this year. We just saw Nabers command the highest first read target share of any player in fantasy points data history.
What? Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. Theo Gremminger here today with Ryan Heath, also of Fantasy Points. We're going to talk about advanced statistical information that can help you crush your Dynasty leagues in 2025. And Ryan, we're going to hit on a bunch of players, but we're going to specifically hit on some players that cost a ton in Dynasty. We're not trying to unearth some sleeper. We're not debating which wide receiver 3 is the one you want to have like deep and buried on your roster. We're not talking about some handcuff running back. We're talking about expensive players and will they deliver in 2025. You just dropped an awesome article over at Fantasy Points. I highly recommend you check that out. It's called 32 Advanced Stats for 32 NFL Teams. And you had some like gambling information in there, like ways to exploit the prop markets, which was very, very interesting. But I think that the article for me, there was a lot of takeaways there that can really help redraft managers and really, really help dynasty managers, because a lot of the players you wrote about are just hot button players in dynasty, guys that are going very highly in dynasty startups that have a huge, huge trade equity if you want to move them off your roster and cost you an absolute fortune if you want to acquire them. And let's start off at the very top. And we had a discussion in the pre-show. And this year, Ja'Marr Chase is like the 101 in dynasty startup, like single QB dynasty startup drafts. He's the first non-quarterback off the board in Superflex dynasty startups. He's also the 101 on Underdog. He's the 101 in FFPC redraft, the 101 in NFFC redraft. Ja'Marr Chase is the 101 everywhere. But at the end of the day, is there a case to be made that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to have his first RB1 overall season and is the one you want if you miss out on Chase early in drafts?
Yeah, there's definitely a case, and we saw that case kind of play out right in front of us at the end of last season. So across 4 games with David Montgomery out or limited, including in the playoffs, we saw Gibbs average over 165 yards from scrimmage per game. If that were across a 17-game season, he would have beaten Chris Johnson's record by over 300 scrimmage yards. He's just unbelievable if he is ever placed into a real full-time role, right? And this isn't even like the Chase Brown experience last year to make a comparison. It's not like Gibbs was getting every single snap in like a totally unsustainable way over this period. He was at like a 66% snap share that would have ranked 10th among running backs. That's like a Tony Pollard level snap share. And that, yeah, the Lions will always have a second back involved, but if that pendulum swings from being a literal 50-50 workload by XFP between him and Montgomery to even being 60-40, then yeah, Gibbs can easily just be the overall RB1. The Lions have had one of the most valuable backfields in the league over the past 2 seasons. That offense is great. Obviously, losing Ben Johnson hurts a bit, but a new OC could be looking to make his mark here, could be wanting to just play his most efficient player. Jahmyr Gibbs leads the NFL by far in yards per carry over the past 3 seasons. Literally, like James Cook is second behind him, and he's over half a yard lower. So, yeah, I just can see a scenario very easily where Gibbs is just the huge smash in 2025 that you need. He is pretty easily my dynasty RB2. I have him over Ashton Gianti. And yeah, I'm pretty happy to click Gibbs like in the middle of the first, especially where he's going right now, generally in redraft.
Yeah, and on our single QB dynasty rankings at Fantasy Points, which I worked on with you and Scott Barrett, we have Jahmyr Gibbs 6 overall, but we have all 3 running backs back to back to back. And that's sort of how it's reflected in dynasty startups. Genti, I've seen go off the board as a first running back. I've seen Bijan go off the board as a first running back. Gibbs usually goes off the board as the RB2 or the RB3. It's not, you don't get much of a discount, but it's a little bit of a cushion between him and the RB1 overall. But when you start unpacking some of these stats, it's just ridiculous. So over the last 2 seasons, David Montgomery has scored 25 rushing touchdowns in 28 regular season games. So, like, been a big impediment from Jahmyr Gibbs hitting that ceiling. So, despite David Montgomery, last year we had a 1,400-yard season for Gibbs, rushing wise, and touchdown scoring is just phenomenal for Gibbs. This stat kind of blew me away, and it's one that always just sort of gives everybody pause. Jahmyr Gibbs has more touchdowns in his first 2 seasons as a pro than Barry Sanders. Jahmyr Gibbs has 31 touchdowns in 32 regular season games. Barry Sanders had 30 in 31 regular season games. So one more game played. But when we mentioned the name like Barry Sanders, we're talking about arguably the best Lions offensive player ever. Jahmyr Gibbs is right on par with him. And it just feels like if we're trying to pick a player that could be the 101 in 2026 in redraft and actually gain value in Dynasty, it could be Jahmyr Gibbs. And Ryan, another thing we talked about was the receiving upside. He's been so efficient as a receiver. And that's really like when we were talking about the profile coming out, we had visions that this could be a Reggie Bush, Alvin Kamara-esque talent, catching just so many passes out of the backfield. He's had 52 catches in back-to-back seasons. Really, really good. But you bring up John Morton trying to expand his role potentially because he's a new offensive coordinator, wants to make a name for himself. I mean, the receiving ceiling for Jahmyr Gibbs is he could get Christian McCaffrey usage out of the backfield.
Yeah, and that's the thing when we talk about, oh, he only needs a few additional snaps per game. It just matters what those snaps are, right? If those are the high value touches that are around the goal line and in the receiving game, then yeah, Gibbs can absolutely be the RB1 on a 55 to 60% snap share, as we've kind of been saying. So yeah, that's really the key with him. It's just a player that I want to be betting on. I want to be betting on like the really good and most efficient players that have only been incredible since they've come into the league. It's generally is going to work out well for you.
Yeah, I was in an NFFC 350 last night, a RotoWire online championship draft, and I had the 6th spot, and I really wanted Gibbs. He went 5th. So I think you're going to find that his ADP in a lot of these drafts this summer as it moves along is going to kind of be a sort of a wide range. Sometimes you'll see him fall as low as 8. Sometimes he goes as high as 3. And then in dynasty startups, like we talked about, sometimes he's the RB2, sometimes he's the RB3. Really, really could have an unbelievable season. Looking forward to seeing just how high he can climb in year 3. Let's talk about another running back who's been steamed up in the dynasty marketplace and also in the best ball marketplace. Bucky Irving was a player that we were very high on at Fantasy Points last season. We sort of predicted the takeover from Rachaad White, and it was a takeover sort of with an exclamation point. Over the second half of last season, Bucky Irving sort of obliterated Rachaad White. We saw it in the NFL playoffs where the touches were just out of control in Bucky Irving's favor in that game against the Washington Commanders. Irving has steamed up, though. This is a player that if you're drafting in redraft, you're drafting in on underdog, this is a player that's going kind of around the 2-3 turn. But Ryan, I find him consistently going in the second round more times than not. And then in dynasty startups, over on FFPC, he's settled in as the RB7 in startups, ahead of Travion Henderson, ahead of Breece Hall, and considerably about half a round ahead of guys like Jonathan Taylor, Quinshon Judkins. When we talk about Bucky Irving as a dynasty asset, he becomes a more interesting conversation than best ball and redraft because the profile, smaller back who's drafted on day 3, despite his immense success, it always gives certain dynasty managers pause. Are you there with Bucky Irving that he's going to be a rule breaker, a trend breaker, sort of an Aaron Jones day 3 type that'll hold value? The last player that we saw with this sort of argument was Kyren Williams, who ended up having a much more volume in year 2 than he did in year 1. Bucky's, I think, way more dynamic potentially than Kyren Williams. Where are you at on Bucky, your enthusiasm levels for him, and just how high can he climb in 2025?
Yeah, my enthusiasm is pretty high for him. I agree that what you just said lines up with my experience in dynasty startups as well. That especially in some of these more like in the bubble leagues, like where people are very, very cautious about investing in running backs, I have found consistently that he's been available at prices that I quite like. At any time in like a startup when you can send kind of like a future first and a plus for him, I've been doing that. And the reason for that is I just think he's an incredible player. And we kind of saw that, just like with Jahmyr Gibbs, we saw what the Bucs really wanted to do at the end of last season. In his 5 healthy post-bye games, Irving averaged 17.9 expected fantasy points per game. That would have been 6th most among running backs. That was even with Rachaad White there. In the playoffs, they gave him, I believe it was every backfield touch in their one playoff game or close to it. And that's not even like the theoretical ceiling of his workload, right? Irving only ran more routes than Rachaad White in 3 of their 16 games together. He happened to average over 22 fantasy points per game in those 3 games, right? And again, all of those were kind of mixed in at the end of the season. So Irving doesn't even need to totally take over all of the passing down stuff. It would be nice and it would be sick if he did, obviously. But even if it's kind of similar to the end of last season, he's being drafted like below his projected workload if we were just to take that as the baseline. So yeah, I'm really happy to take him at the 2-3 turn in redraft. Really happy to have him in Dynasty. As you mentioned, like this archetype of running back is always going to have trouble holding or gaining dynasty value as much, but I'm okay just kind of making the bet on the really good running back in this situation, because the cost is not as bad as another like fragile and expensive running back like a Saquon Barkley, for example.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, Bucky Irving for me, I have exposure to him. I have a number of dynasty rosters with Bucky Irving where I'm counting on him to be a big player. I do think it's interesting. David Montgomery always seems to come into the equation when we're talking about Jahmyr Gibbs, but people have sort of written Rachaad White off. Would you agree that for Bucky Irving really to take that, like Ryan, when we're drafting him RB7, you're not drafting a guy RB7 saying, hey, we're just want to get like some low-end RB1 production. You're drafting a guy at RB7 hoping for like Breece Hall year 2 production. Like you want a guy who can give you a near 20 point per game performance in at least one of the next 2 seasons. Would you argue that he's not going to be able to reach that sort of ceiling unless they really phase Rachaad White out of the passing game? And that's easier said than done. Rachaad White has become sort of an afterthought. We mentioned how they moved away from him in the playoffs for sure and down the stretch. But over the last 3 seasons, Rachaad White has 165 receptions in only 3 seasons as a pro. Very good pass blocker. For what it's worth, not an explosive runner, but a solid pass catcher. Do you see that do you agree with that a little bit, where it's a little bit of a cap ceiling with Rachaad White still involved in the offense? Or do you think it's more of a year 2 Bucky Irving, the trust factor, they could phase Rachaad White out because it's just going to make their offense a little bit better and more explosive?
I think it all kind of depends on what this offense looks like post Liam Cohn. So I would agree on most teams that yes, to hit that 20-point upside, you're going to need Irving to take over most of the third down snaps and the pass catching work. And that I would agree with you that Rachaad White at least does do that competently. I'm not necessarily expecting him to get shoved out of that role. But we saw last year that even when Irving is on the field on first and second down, the Bucs did a really good job of making sure to just manufacture all of these screen passes to get the ball in his hands. And even if he's running fewer routes than White, he was having just as many targets or receptions because of that kind of intentional design usage to get the ball in the hands of their most explosive player, really. So Yeah, I think if that kind of carries over with new OC Josh Grizzard, then no, Irving doesn't need White to totally go away to be able to sniff like a 20-point per game season. It would be nice, of course, but I do kind of think he has that out.
Yeah, and when the one change with Grizzard from Cohen is last year, if you go to Fantasy Points data, design targets, and you've done articles about design targets, highly recommend you check out Ryan's. I mean, all of your articles are bangers, but when you break down some of these statistical models that we have on Fantasy Points data and sort of break them down and how they apply to fantasy, I think it's really, really helpful to fantasy managers. But they had 2 players in the top 5 in design targets among all running backs. No other team had 2 inside the top 20. So we want to think that Grizzard is going to continue that trend. So even if White's a bit of a pain, I still think Irving could really, really hit. And it's exactly the kind of profile that betting on youth, betting on upside, betting on receiving ability, and explosive plays, you get those all out of Irving. So it's really you kind of get a little bit of a discount because people don't want to believe in him because of the size and because of the draft capital. A little Billy Bean in there. Ryan, let's talk about RJ Harvey. RJ Harvey's been an interesting one where it's been peaks and valleys. Massive peak with the landing spot, sort of settled in as this player that a lot of enthusiasm surrounding him, where a lot of other sites sort of caught up to us at Fantasy Points. Brett Whitefield, incredibly enthusiastic about Harvey, had him as RB3 before the NFL draft. I had him inside my top 6 running backs. You had him inside your top 6. Scott had him inside his top 5. Like, we were ahead of the curve. And all these people saying, oh, surprising day 2 selection. It's only surprising if you're not paying attention, and you're not listening to Fantasy Points and sort of knowing ball. So pat on our backs for that one. But now we have a little bit of a valley here because J.K. Dobbins was objectively very good last year, had his best season as a pro, signs within the division with the Denver Broncos. Harvey's a player that still is very valuable in Dynasty. I'd argue that there's a small window to trade for him because I think the year 1 expectations are now sort of tempered. Do you think that that the Dobbins signing there was reflective of their feelings for Audric Estime, Jaleel McLaughlin, their trust factor for those guys? Or do you think I'm Sean Payton, and I'm going to use 2 running backs this year. Both these guys are good. I'm going to get them both touches, and we'll see what happens.
So I think it is primarily because the Broncos right now before they signed Dobbins did not really have a pass blocker at all anywhere on the depth chart. And you can see that pretty clearly just by looking at the third down snaps that Broncos running backs played last year. It was almost entirely Javonte Williams on third downs. And yeah, it's because they don't trust 160-pound Jaleel McLaughlin or Estime, whose pass blocking skills just didn't really develop, I guess, to Sean Payton's liking last year on those third downs. And Harvey, as electric as he is with the ball in his hands, as well as I think he projects like as a receiver actually catching the ball and turning upfield, yeah, definitely an unproven pass blocker. Makes sense to get a veteran in that room to like at minimum fill that role, right? But that doesn't really mean anything for Harvey's ceiling in year 1 as far as I'm concerned, right? This is a running back who was not signed until after the NFL draft. I mean, we have rumors that the Broncos were looking at Dobbins even before the draft, but that would only imply that he did not have enough of a market for them to have to make a move earlier than that, right? Yes, he got volume last year, was not all that impressive after the first few weeks of the season. So if you are like a believer in RJ Harvey's talent, I don't think that this J.K. Dobbins signing should affect your opinion really at all. If he's good, he's going to beat out Dobbins for touches. And I mean, really zooming out, the biggest thing is that there's such a huge opportunity for that here in this Broncos offense. Last year, they led the NFL in target share to the backfield, which is hilarious because none of their running backs were worth a damn for fantasy. It's because of all these
Javonte Williams
Williams snaps.
Javonte was top 5 in running back targets. It's sort of no one would have thought that unless you dove into it, because he was just so, like you said, so inefficient. And Ryan, to your like argument with the running back targets, they were first overall in running back targets 2 seasons ago, where they had like 3 backs involved. McLaughlin had a solid rookie year. We saw Samaje Perine have a really solid year. So this is, I completely agree. Like, the targets in that backfield are a given. In a Lombardi Peyton offense, you're going to see running back targets. That's going to really help the team. And then when we talk about tendencies, Bo Nix is incredibly accurate. That was sort of his MO coming out of Oregon. And last year, incredibly accurate passer as a rookie, throws very few interceptions, very tight with the football. Bucky Irving led the nation in running back receptions while at Oregon. So, like, this is all sort of setting up. I think that there's a argument in redraft and best ball to have exposure to either one of these backs. I think that if one goes down, the other could really run away with it. But I do think that there's a window now where Harvey's being underrated. The other just general truth with J.K. Dobbins is this year, everybody's sort of like, oh, old guys and previously injured guys just stay healthy. Last year, James Conner played every game. J.K. Dobbins played 13 games. Ryan, here's the games played for J.K. Dobbins in his career. Played 15 games as a rookie, played 8 games as a second-year player, played in only 1 game in 2023. I believe he was injured in the first quarter of that game. Painfully so. He had like a couple targets in that first quarter, was really setting up well usage-wise. And then last year played 13, and people are having a parade because he played 13 games. So just the general truth is this has been a guy that's been had incredibly bad injury luck. Harvey's the younger back with juice. I also think what's interesting with Harvey, like when I say younger, like he's only a little bit younger because RJ Harvey's an older prospect. I don't think you draft RJ Harvey to not play him, especially when you used a second round pick. And a lot of us thought maybe he'd go in round 3. So they used a second round pick on him. They even took him ahead of where we were bullish on him, and we still thought round 3 possibly. So I'm with you. I think this is, if anything, a buying window. We're not going to be scared. We're not going to play cautious when it comes to Harvey. One player who was just through the roof last year in terms of dynasty startup cost was Marvin Harrison Jr. This was a player that was going side by side with Amon-Ra St. Brown last year in dynasty startups. I can recall there was just a real argument that it was Chase, Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, who was coming off of his wide receiver 1 overall season. And then do you take Marvin Harrison Jr. or do you take Amon-Ra St. Brown? It's just kind of comical now to think that he was touching up on the Chase, Jefferson, Lamb trio after what happened last year with his rookie season. A lot of it was due to Arizona's usage of Marvin Harrison Jr. I don't think he's untalented, but the fit doesn't seem to be perfect. This year, there's been a major correction in dynasty startups, but he's still going pretty high up. Marvin Harrison Jr. has settled in as the wide receiver 10. So he's going side by side with Ladd McConkey, usually right after Ladd, somewhere around that 2-3 turn in FFPC Triflex leagues right now. So this is a player that, despite having a number of issues last year, is still considered to be a very premium asset to have as a wide receiver. And then in terms of bounce back, breakout, every single article you'll find on a lot of these other sites, Ryan, is saying that this is the year Marvin Harrison Jr. just puts it together. Just an easy name for people when they're looking for a year 2 breakout candidate. We did see Marvin Harrison scoring down the stretch be up there. Like the last 2 weeks for fantasy managers were very strong. We saw some positive coach speak towards the end of the season where the Arizona coaching staff specifically said, we're going to get the ball to Marvin Harrison Jr., and they did. When you take an offseason of self-scouting and you're the Arizona Cardinals and you have Trey McBride, and then wide receiver 2 is sort of a mixed bag of guys like Michael Wilson, do you say we've got to find more efficient ways to use Marvin Harrison Jr. to get him the ball more often to really advance our offense? Or do you have trepidation that it's just going to continue to be sort of a weird fit?
Yeah, mostly that. So I'll start by saying I agree that Marvin Harrison is very talented. If you look at metrics that can try to kind of isolate how just he performs, then he looks great, right? In average separation score against man coverage, he was top 5 last year, up with Ladd McConkey and Jamar Chase and like Zay Flowers. Like the guy can play for sure. But yeah, I'm just a little bit wary of projecting this Cardinals coaching staff to suddenly change what they were doing for most of last year, right? And it's not like just on them. It's also, I understand looking at Marvin Harrison at like in terms of his body type and the type of receiver he is, and deploying him on the outside as much as they have, right? Among 100 qualifying wide receivers and tight ends, Harrison saw the 4th highest share of his targets on the outside rather than over the middle of the field. So that's not like where he's lining up. That's where the targets actually are going. It's overwhelmingly on the sidelines, right? And the fact is, in today's NFL, a target over the middle is worth about 22% more than a target on the outside. So these receivers that can kind of line up all over the place, get in on these in-breaking routes more, are going to be more efficient and are going to score more fantasy points. Harrison is good at in-breaking routes. You can just pull up his route tree in terms of average separation score. He was 95th percentile on in-breakers, 82nd percentile on hitches, but the Cardinals are just having him run a lot of these kind of clear out routes, a lot of the go stuff, a lot of the corners, and it just makes it very hard for him to be a consistent fantasy asset. I also feel like during the season last year, we were kind of beating this drum of like, wow, Harrison is so efficient on these crossing routes and the Cardinals barely use him on them. They actually did increase his usage on crossers midway through the season. I don't know if the Fantasy Points data account had tweeted it out at them enough times or whatever, and they saw it, but they did increase his usage on those, but it still only bumped his receiving yards per game by like 5 or 6 yards. And it's just because of how this Cardinals offense is. It's not particularly pass heavy. Trey McBride is just sitting in the middle of the field, commanding the highest first read target share in Fantasy Points data history by a tight end. So just to put a bow on all of it, while I get it, Harrison's great. In Dynasty, I want to be betting on players that I think can put up really big seasons this year, because you have to do that in order to gain value, right? Yes, you want to sign up for talented players, but you also want to sign up for players that are going to score fantasy points this year. And those are the ones that are going to hold value. So yeah, I would much rather have Ladd McConkey. I've been saying that for 6 months at this point, pretty much to the point where I cannot get Ladd at any reasonable ADP in any league I'm in, because people know my thoughts there. But yeah, I'm taking like the Jackson Smith and Jigbas and the Rashee Rices in redraft, like the Devontae Adamses, T. Higgins over Marvin Harrison.
Yeah, it's interesting. When it comes to Marvin Harrison, a lot of the arguments for Harrison are we saw peak Trey McBride usage. And like I get it. His target share was immense. The first read rate was immense. Trey McBride sort of broke Fantasy Points data for what a tight end could do. But I think it's just for people to assume that that's the peak ceiling for Trey McBride, like in terms of usage, I think that's a sort of wishful thinking for the pro Marvin Harrison Jr. argument. You saw some very big accounts, Ryan, like, guys on ESPN and stuff talking about how they have to utilize Marvin Harrison Jr. a lot more. I just think when it comes to Trey McBride, I made a call, and I don't even think it's that bold, on Fantasy Football Daily. I had Andrew Erickson on. We did a bold prediction show, and I said that this might have been actually this show with Matt Kelly last week. I said that both Trey McBride and Brock Bowers are both going to break Zach Ertz's record for most targets in a season. I think with Trey McBride, like, we saw 147 targets this year in 16 games played. There's absolutely no reason with this sort of profile after the contract they paid him, especially with Kyler Murray's tendency to go to the tight end position a lot, that McBride couldn't have 165 targets this year. So that's an interesting one. When it comes to Harrison Jr., I agree with you. I'm Ladd McConkey ahead of him, and that's reflected in our rankings at Fantasy Points. Scott's also agrees with us on that one. Scott might be lower on Marvin Harrison Jr. than the two of us. But I do think Marvin Harrison Jr. is appealing for a breakout season, and it's simply consistency. And I think that's one thing that we sometimes see younger players gain in their scoring outcomes in year 2 or heading into year 3. It's a wild stat here, but Marvin Harrison Jr. had 8 games with fewer than 8 PPR points, and a couple of these were near zeros. The week 1 was like a 2-pointer. He had another week where he scored like fewer than 2 points. So 8 games with 8 PPR points or fewer. And then he had 8 games with 15 or more PPR points. So if we can just flip the script and turn that into like 4 games for fewer than 8 points, I mean, he might not have any games with fewer than 8 points this year. So I think we've seen him be able to put up spike weeks, but a little more consistency in those games where he's a complete dud. A lack of those sort of games, I think, is just an easy bet. So I think at the end of the season, Marvin Harrison Jr. will be drafted about where he's going now in dynasty startups. I think he's going to be a wide receiver 1, but I do think he'll be behind, the Lad McConkeys, BTJs, Malik Nabers, certainly. So really, I mean, a disappointing pick if you took him ahead of those guys in rookie drafts 2 seasons ago. Ryan, I'm all over Drake London. You're all over Drake London as well. Your article talked about Drake London and his touchdown ceiling, which is interesting because a lot of the arguments with Drake London is wide receiver 1 overall, has led the league in receptions, led the league in targets in 4 straight seasons. Drake London, I think, checks those boxes. I think he might be the lowest drafted wide receiver that can become the wide receiver 1 right now in fantasy football. Dynasty, he's just a fantastic asset. I took him in a recent FFPC Triflex startup draft in like round 2. I'm all over London. But you made some references to his touchdown ceiling. If London's able to get a high number of touchdowns, Ryan, then we're talking about a potential league winner.
Yeah. So, and the reason I'm so kind of enamored with this is that all of his stats and usage around the end zone last year were just incredible. So across the full season, he led the NFL in end zone target share. So that's just all of the targets that each team throws into the end zone. London had the highest share, seeing 56% of the Falcons' end zone targets, right? And just off of pure volume, it was also awesome. In Michael Penix's 3 starts, so a 3-game sample, but 6 end zone targets in those 3 games. So averaged 117 receiving yards per game and 2 end zone targets per game with Michael Penix, right? And that would have led all wide receivers over the past 4 seasons if he kept that up. Like, again, 3-game sample, but that was like the little peak that we got. And I just kind of love the fit here. We have seen Penix just throw the deep ball a ton. He did it at the 6th highest rate to go 20 plus yards downfield last year. And there's just nobody else on the Falcons that is really a credible red zone threat, in my opinion. The only other pass catcher on the team over 6 feet tall is Kyle Pitts, who they have potentially just given up on. He's not even at Ted End University this year. So, yeah, I don't know. Pitt's career low 67% route participation last year just really was kind of falling off at the end of the season. So I think the easiest bet that I gave out in this entire article was for London to go over 6.5 receiving touchdowns. That has since been steamed up a lot on DraftKings at least, but you can shop around and find a decent line for that probably. Yeah, I really love London this year. Kind of just love his cost in all formats.
39% target share in games played with Michael Penix last year. The air yard share was through the roof, and the fantasy scoring numbers were through the roof. I love London this year. I know you do as well. We'll continue to sort of pound the table for London. I think he's just a great value. And if you start running back in the first round, I mean, you could go Jahmyr Gibbs, Drake London right now. Not a bad start in any format. Malik Nabers' ceiling this year with Russell Wilson / Jackson Dart. Obviously an elite target earner. Malik Nabers, one of the best scoring seasons of all time at the wide receiver position for all rookies in the history of the NFL, and broke the receptions record for rookie wide receivers. So he ended up not having as many receptions as Brock Bowers. Bowers played more games, though. So really neck and neck with Bowers there. Does Malik Nabers have what it takes to be the wide receiver one overall, even with the question marks that we have with the New York Giants offense. Russell Wilson came out and said that Nabers is the best wide receiver in the league, said he's a special talent. One of the main reasons he signed with New York is because of Malik Nabers. He says Malik Nabers will be the best wide receiver he's ever played with, which I think that we're absolutely there. But sort of your ceiling expectation for Nabers right now, Ryan.
Yeah, so I totally think Nabers can be the wide receiver one overall this year, and you're correct. They were really like the key is just the quarterback play and how that ends up shaking out. Just for a little bit of perspective, just to gauge quarterback play in terms of how it translates to fantasy points, I like to look at catchable air yards per game. So just looking at the Giants last year in that stat, they finished 29th, 133.7 catchable air yards per game. And just looking at all of the options in this quarterback room, it's really hard to imagine how that could be any worse this year. Russell Wilson, who you mentioned, finished 23rd in catchable air yards per game last year. So a decent bump from the awful QB play the Giants had. Jameis Winston, if he ever finds a way to start, was first by far and away. We know this. He's just the best quarterback for the fantasy fortunes of all of his pass catchers. And then looking at Jackson Dart, if he finds his way onto the field later in the season, he led the class in average depth of target and in his rate of throwing over 20 yards downfield. That was a stat from Graham Barfield back around draft time. So you can kind of choose your own adventure here. I think it's likely Russ that is starting in week one, and that's kind of like the worst of all worlds, but it can only get better from there. We just saw Nabers command the highest first read target share of any player in fantasy points data history. That includes like when Cooper Kupp won the Triple Crown. It includes when Aaron Rodgers literally traded for Devontae Adams just so that he could throw targets to him. All of these insane like target commanding wide receiver seasons we've seen over the last 4 years, Nabers was better than all of them in first read target share. And again, that's what one of the most predictive things you can look at is just the volume a receiver commands. Giants added no real other pass catchers, no real additional target competition. I expect it to be very similar. So yeah, as long as they're not like as woefully inefficient as we saw last season, then yeah, Nabers can easily be the wide receiver one overall.
Yeah, he had one of the best seasons ever for fantasy points data. And just from a raw targets number, you're talking about over 11 targets per game. That's truly special and unique. I believe that over the last 5 years, we've only seen like 3 players reach that number. So yeah, I think Malik Nabers is just fantastic. I think a year from now, there's a chance Malik Nabers is the wide receiver one overall in Dynasty, ahead of Justin Jefferson, ahead of Ja'Marr Chase, which was sort of sacrilege to even suggest that 2 seasons ago. But I think Nabers, it's just easy to sort of see. We haven't had a 200 target player in the NFL since Julio Jones. Nabers could do it this year. I mean, it's just a matter of him playing every single game and seeing his target share go up, or not even necessarily the target share. I think just if he maintains it and New York just runs more plays this year and is able to sustain more drives, he could hit it. It's not even asking for much of a change in terms of usage. 170 targets last year, Ryan, just incredible. Let's go a little bit further down. We're not necessarily talking about sleepers, but one interesting player is Cedric Tillman. Cedric Tillman had just Cedric Tillman mania last year as a waiver wire addition. He was lighting the NFL on fire for about a month. It was a very short sample size, but we saw Tillman score at a very high rate. Now there's really no wide receiver 2 competition to speak of in Cleveland, unless you're like predicting for a big Deontay Johnson bounce back. So it's sort of David Njoku, Jerry Jeudy, and Cedric Tillman just sort of chilling. And nobody's really enthusiastic about this player. But it's interesting. When you look at Tillman's profile, was a 3rd-round pick, has size, so we've got day 2 draft capital. We have seen him thrive on a fantasy football field, an NFL football field, and put up fantasy football numbers. Is the enthusiasm level for Cedric Tillman just too low because people don't want to roster Browns? Or is it people don't necessarily believe in what they saw last year because it was such a short sample size?
Yeah, I think I can tell you exactly what this is. It is Travis Fulgham derangement syndrome is the problem we're seeing with Cedric Tillman and why people will not get excited. Nobody wants to be the guy that touts the player who was really good in a small sample and then just disappears, right? Travis Fulgham very famously did that, whatever that was, probably 5 or more years ago now for the Eagles for like a month, and was never to be heard from again. But I don't think that's what this is with Cedric Tillman. And you're not paying as if he just broke out, which is what we might have just seen. So let me take you back to last season with Cedric Tillman. Didn't do really that much as a rookie. Started last year as not a full-time player. Amari Cooper gets traded. Over the next 4 games, Tillman leads the Browns in targets per game with 9.8 and first read target share, almost a 26% one, right? It averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game over that month. All of this is ahead of Jerry Jeudy, ahead of Elijah Moore, ahead of David Njoku. And this is his second year, right? If he just had not been concussed at the end of that stretch and missed the rest of the season, this easily in hindsight could have been, oh wow, this was like the year 2 wide receiver breakout that came out of nowhere, and now we're projecting him to continue to be a really good NFL receiver for the rest of his career. But you're not paying as if that's the case for Tillman in any format right now, either on Underdog or in Dynasty. So yeah, it's just really easy for me to click his name when we're talking about a double-digit round pick in all formats. A young receiver that maybe just kind of broke out that no one is really paying attention to.
You know, I had Scott Connor on this show, and I think Scott does a good job with identifying players like this that are sort of mispriced by the Dynasty community. He's got the name brand equity where if you roster Cedric Tillman and he starts out the year strongly, people are going to look at him as I messed up, I want to get a little more exposure to him. So there's a number of outs for you with rostering Tillman. It's not like, and a nice Travis Fulgham reference, but it's not quite Travis Fulgham because we do have the draft capital backing up Tillman. Again, 3rd round pick, played in the SEC at Tennessee, but he's the sort of player that you could flip this year because it's a little bit of an opportunistic wide receiver too, or on his team, or he ends up defying expectations and you ended up with a mispriced player. I really like Jeudy and I really like Njoku. I do think that this is a team that is so beat up, but it's such a consolidated target tree that no matter who the quarterback is there, these guys are all going to be sort of have fantasy utility for us. So I think Tillman's a really, really interesting one, Ryan. Let's talk about targets per route run. And over at Fantasy Points data, I put in a qualifier of you needed at least 75 total targets. And I'm looking at the targets per route run leaders from last season, and it's guys you'd expect. Puka Nacua, 0.38. Malik Nabers, 0.32. Drake London, 0.30. And right next to him, Josh Downs, 0.30. There's Josh Downs mania, Josh Downs hysteria. I think Scott Barrett is basically shooting himself in the foot on X because Scott wants to trade for him in Dynasty everywhere, but he can't stop tweeting very positive things about Josh Downs out there. So, and Scott's not the only one. Like Scott's all over him. You're all over him. There's a lot of really sharp people on Josh Downs. I took him in the 7th round last night in an NFFC draft, which is a redraft league. I thought that was a very good price, especially for a start 3 wide receiver format with a flex, very wide receiver heavy format. Downs, though, has gone in fuego. The Dynasty price tag has gone up and up this offseason, but has it gone high enough, Ryan? Do you think that this is a profile that's still being severely underrated by the Dynasty community? Does he have the potential to be the next targets per route run superstar?
To answer the last part, he absolutely does. And to your point, if you just look at the top 10 wide receivers last year by targets per route run, all of them average at least 16 fantasy points per game, except for Josh Downs and except for Cooper Kupp, who was just extremely washed kind of down the stretch there and very inefficient. So yeah, it's only like the league superstar receivers that are doing what Downs did in terms of commanding targets. Obviously, Downs is only going to play in 11 personnel, so the targets per route run is a little bit advantageous to him compared to what he can actually do on a football field if he's only playing in the slot. But yeah, he still is cheap enough that I don't really care about that I don't really feel the need to nitpick, right? Just in games without Anthony Richardson last year, Downs averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game. He was the wide receiver 17. Anthony Richardson looks less and less likely to be the Colts week 1 starter as the days go on, where he's getting second opinions on his shoulder. And every Colts wide receiver is just kind of like saying without saying that they're rooting for Daniel Jones. There's a lot of really interesting splits out there from Football Insights on Twitter talking about the horizontally breaking routes that Downs does most of his work on are like the worst routes for Anthony Richardson in terms of accuracy. And it's the opposite for Daniel Jones. So, and I mean, that makes sense when you watch Anthony Richardson, right? It's like all his wow plays are, he's throwing vertically down the field and he's hitting some of these impossible throws, but like he can't hit an out and he sails it 5 yards over the receiver's head. And that bears out in the data. And yeah, Daniel Jones is just a very different type of quarterback in terms of that specific usage. And yeah, it just kind of dovetails with what Downs wants to do. So yeah, I still don't think he's certainly not too expensive in redraft or in best ball now. I don't know. I've seen him go over guys like Jalen Waddle and Emeka Egbuka in Dynasty. I'm not quite at that point, but those might just be some really sicko leagues that love Josh Downs.
Yeah, or maybe you get awarded for targets per route run in those leagues, and you get a little boost there or something like that. Yeah, I can't. Downs over Egbuka, I can't. I cannot do that. The Waddle one's interesting because Waddle, the offense regressed last year, but I'm still probably a Waddle ahead of Downs. I mean, I think Downs is a guy where I'll take both sides here. If I'm in a startup, I don't mind adding him. If I'm in a redraft league, I'm in a best ball league, I don't mind adding him. But just fundamentally, due to the steam that he has in the Dynasty community, if somebody wants to trade me for my Josh Downs, I might have a window where I could trade him for just slightly more because I think that he could hit it, Ryan. But I do think right now people are paying a little bit for a projection rather than something that we really anticipate. And I think that another factor with Downs is, and really for all the Colts wide receivers, is none of them are really a prototypical NFL alpha wide receiver. Like Downs is a opportunistic wide receiver one, not a high profile wide receiver one. That sort of profile where Indianapolis a year from now might draft a quarterback in round 1 and then say in round 2, let's add another wide receiver, somebody who's just a consistent winner on the outside. That's not Adonai Mitchell. That's not Alec Pierce. Downs, will leave him in the slot. He's really good at that, but let's add somebody to sort of take over for Michael Pittman, who will be in the third year of his contract and whatnot. So I think that just a long-term, Downs is not nearly as safe as a guy like Egbuka, who was the 19th overall selection, and Waddle, just because we've sort of seen it, and he has the contract insulation. So I'm neutral on Downs right now in Dynasty. Let's talk about Tet McMillan. Tet McMillan's a player that obviously we're very high on at fantasy points, but what are your year 1 expectations for his scoring numbers? We've seen him steam up. He's going inside of round 4, round 5 in FFPC redraft leagues. And in Dynasty leagues, we're seeing him going at a really steamed up position. I think not like too steamed up when we're talking about McMillan, but we're seeing him going as a very high end wide receiver 2. So he's going right alongside guys like Rashee Rice, guys like T. Higgins, guys like A.J. Brown, and fellow rookie Travis Hunter in these Dynasty startups.
Yeah, just for the Dynasty cost, I'm totally fine with that for Tet. He is in that tier of wide receivers that I'm totally willing to take, like in the third round, that there's kind of like a large fall off after. I totally include him in that tier. In redraft, I think he's going pretty much exactly where he should be, pretty much exactly where we have him projected. But I'm just very bullish on him and kind of making this bet on the Panthers this year, oddly enough. So if you look at only the throws that Bryce Young had last year that we deemed on target at Fantasy Points data per our charting team, all of Bryce Young's receivers combined for the most dropped air yards in the NFL. You can split that out even further and see that Xavier Legette and David Moore were just horrible, especially on the outside. Like they just did not have an outside wide receiver they could go to at all last year. So Tet just instantly kind of creates an upgrade for this entire offense when he slots in at X, because it lets an Adam Thielen or a Jalen Coker kick back inside to like their more natural position in the slot. It just makes everything kind of work better. And we saw a really big improvement from Bryce Young last year. He was top 10 in accuracy and catchable throw rate on the deep ball, top 15 in accuracy when he was targeting the outside. Like, this is a quarterback that can get the ball down the field and to the outside and support fantasy scoring for Tet McMillan. He just kind of didn't have the help last year. So yeah, I really like Tet here. And then you just have the draft capital that was even better than expected, going at number 8 overall. Just looking at wide receivers drafted inside the top 10 over the past few years, they've averaged 7.5 targets per game and just over 1,000 receiving yards as rookies. And that pretty much, like I said, Tet's going exactly where he should in redraft. That type of season would be pretty good for where he's going. So yeah, I am pro Tet. I will be pro Tet for the entirety of this offseason.
Yeah, I think that, you talked about guys you'd move for Marvin Harrison Jr. I would consider moving Marvin Harrison Jr. for Tet McMillan plus, because I think that the targets are going to be really high for Tet. This is an offense that's just screaming out for a player like him. They showed us that they agree with us on that statement, because they took him inside of the top 10 overall picks. They had opportunities to trade down out of that pick. We know that the Rams tried to aggressively move up to get themselves some Tet. How wild would that have been to have a Puka Nacua, Devontae Adams, Tet McMillan trio? That could have been really, really fun for, not necessarily for fantasy managers, but for the Rams themselves. But I think that Tet, it's just, he fills such a need. No Panthers wide receiver broke 50 catches last year. No Panthers wide receiver had more than 615 receiving yards, and that was Adam Thielen in 10 games played. Dave Canales has been like the ADP whisperer for running backs. Rashad White 2 seasons ago, Chuba Hubbard last year. He's been the quarterback whisperer for multiple quarterbacks. I think this year you're going to see the ADP whisperer again for a rookie wide receiver. I think Tet's going to really hit. I think borderline wide receiver 1 numbers are not out of the question. Let's go lightning round on this one, Ryan. Here's an interesting one for you. In Dynasty startups, would you rather have Brian Thomas Jr. as the wide receiver 5 overall or Travis Hunter as the wide receiver 14 overall?
Yeah, I mean, I'm making this decision a lot. I'm always trading up into the elite tier when I can, generally. And so, yeah, Brian Thomas Jr. to keep it short.
Should Brock Bowers be the 101 in single QB tight end premium formats right now in Dynasty startups?
Okay, single QB tight.
So we'll take
not a format I play much.
Okay, so let me translate this into Superflex, because you're a little young to reference single. Around you and Thomas Tipple and you guys, I can't. So let me see if I can translate this into a language that the youth can speak. In Superflex Dynasty startups with tight end premium scoring, should Brock Bowers be the first non-quarterback off the board?
I don't think so personally. I'm still taking Chase and Jefferson over him. But yeah, then Bowers is kind of right there with like a Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow for me. That's where I would slot him in.
And there you go. I think that's actually a perfect response. I think that those 2 wide receivers are just kind of god tier wide receivers. I've seen Bowers go off the board as like the 101 in some of these tight end premium best ball leagues over in FFPC. A couple of contrarians in there $350 redraft big gorilla format. And then in Dynasty startups, I still haven't seen him go off the board as the first non-quarterback in these super flex startups. So like, I agree with you. I think Bowers is right there neck and neck with those wide receivers, but I still lean to Jamar Chase every single time, or Justin Jefferson if you want to be a little contrarian to Chase. Those two guys are just so good, so consistent. And with Chase, we have such a great quarterback situation with Joe Burrow, and I think a very good quarterback situation for Justin Jefferson now that we have clarity that it's going to be J.J. McCarthy. Ryan, you crush it as always. Let everybody know what you have coming out.
Yeah, so this week up on the site, I have statistically significant first downs per route run. The 2025 edition was highly requested that I bring that back. But yeah, basically for those who aren't aware, first downs per route run is kind of just a better and more predictive version of yards per route run. It's a stat we have in the Fantasy Points data suite, and I broke it down a bunch of different ways, using it to spot young breakouts, spot like younger disappointments or older players that could fall off the age cliff, and then also just kind of using it as context for a player's efficiency to see if they are just making big plays and getting all their production on that, or if they're kind of these consistent chain movers. So a really cool read. Would recommend you go check that out.
Yeah, and you can use the code Theo2025 to get yourself some money off of Fantasy Points data or anything else we offer at Fantasy Points for subscriptions, or use the code Ryan2025 as well. And stick with us here at Fantasy Points. Again, Dynasty Points every single Wednesday night. Make sure you subscribe to Fantasy Points YouTube and stick with us at Dynasty Life. We're going to have guests like Ryan all offseason long. We're going to help you crush your Dynasty leagues this season.